My son, you seem troubled. That's what Roger said to me one morning as I arrived for work at the church I served at the time. Roger was sitting peacefully in lotus position. You know, I can't do this. Legs crossed, arms open in meditation, under the tree outside the entrance to the office building of this church. I was indeed troubled by a couple of things that were weighing heavily on me, none of which Roger would have known about. So how did he know that I was troubled? And his apparent perceptiveness and peacefulness seemed to conceal the fact that actually Roger was far more troubled than I was. Roger had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder. He lived in the neighborhood under the care of his sister, and he would often wander over to the church. If it was obvious that he was having a bad day, I'd call his sister. Otherwise, he seemed okay in that he wasn't agitated or unreachable. And yet it was unnerving when he would call me my son, as if he was some wise elder or teacher or spiritual leader. And indeed, there are times where he kind of intimated that he might be Jesus Christ. I didn't believe that, of course, but it was eerie that he could reveal things he couldn't possibly know, and I didn't know how he knew them. And now I look back, and I realize that I was wrong. Roger was Jesus. In that, as Jesus said in our gospel reading this morning from Matthew 25, whatever you did or you did not do to the least, to our members of my family, you did it to me. This story of the sheep being separated from the goats is sometimes called the parable of the judgment of the nations. Some scholars say it's not even really a parable because the main character is identified as the Son of Man. And that's one of the titles for the Messiah, or the Christ, God's chosen, sent to save the people. So rather than a parable, some scholars say this is more of a figurative teaching. I'm not sure what that is or what the difference is. This is a story that depicts the final judgment and clarifies the criteria by which that judgment will be made. And in that, it is very parabolic, in that parables usually take a strange twist or an out-of-the-ordinary turn. The final judgment is where that happens. That's the case with the criteria for judgment in this story, because the criteria, according to this story, is not based on anything most people in Jesus' audience now or then would expect. There's no reference to believing. There's no reference to faithfulness or any spiritual virtues for that matter. It is, as I said when I was preaching 2 weeks ago, when we began reading all these parables in Matthew 25, it's about divine values and gospel priorities. And God's values and priorities set the values and priorities of the world on their head and turn them upside down. God does not judge based on the values and priorities that most of the world holds, nor even the values and priorities that most religious people hold, if they or we are actually honest about that. The ultimate value and priority of God is for the least. The least. That's those whom the world discounts, dismisses, denies, and denigrates. Those whom even religious people misunderstand, or malign and maltreat. I mean, look at the list. Those in prison, the sick, and that's not just those who are physically ill, but those who suffer in body, mind, or spirit. Like Roger in the story I told, Jesus' healing ministry was to the whole person. And the list continues. The stranger, or the lonely, and the alienated, the naked, the thirsty, the hungry, and that could be because of poverty, some disaster, discrimination, oppression, or war, or any other injustice that leaves people food deprived. All of these categories of people that the chosen of God chooses to identify with, the religious people of Jesus' time would have judged to be unrighteous or unclean, unworthy, and unacceptable. Indeed, they would have seen these people's poverty, sickness, imprisonment, oppression, and suffering as signs that God had rejected them, that God had judged them and found them to be unrighteous and unacceptable. Goats, if you will, to use the image in the parable, who need to be separated from the righteous and the worthy sheep. People and nations who needed to be punished. And the hunger and thirst, nakedness and sickness, loneliness and imprisonment were seen as forms of divine punishment by people in Jesus' day. And by many people in our day. Maybe even by some of us in this room. I mean, what's the first thing that we usually think or say when tragedy befalls us and when bad stuff happens? At least one of the first things, what did I do to deserve this? So even we think it's divine punishment sometimes. And so the claim of the righteous or the self-righteous, when did we ever see you, Lord, and not respond to your hunger or thirst, loneliness, nakedness, sickness, or imprisonment? I mean, how could you ever be in prison anyway, since that's only where bad people go? I mean, how could you ever be sick or naked and lonely, hungry or thirsty, since that would mean that you ceased to find favor with God and that God had abandoned you? Surely God would never do that, and neither would we, Lord. So imagine not just their surprise, but their shock. Jaw-dropping, knock me over, faint, dead away shock at the claim that whatever you did not do to the least of these who are part of my family, you did it to me. And then to push the point, it's not like that's why the ones in Jesus on the right, reached out to the least because, they knew it was really Jesus. They didn't know either, okay? They also are shocked by the divine claim. When I was hungry, you gave me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me, and naked, and you clothed me. And when I was in prison, you visited me. And they didn't know that they were ministering to Jesus when they ministered to the least. So why'd they do it? They reached out to the rejected because apparently they thought it was the right thing to do. Maybe because it is the divine value and the gospel priority, even though it's also a risky thing to do. You know, in that we need to go back to the parable from Matthew 25 that we read last week. Remember the one about the talents? Another disturbing parable that challenges us. As Pastor Christine said last Sunday, you know, we've tamed it to make it about talents in the sense of spiritual gifts or abilities. When a talent was a monetary unit, a measure or an amount of money. And the thing the two servants who were praised in the parable have in common is not how much money they had, because they had different amounts, and not even that they both doubled what they had been given, but that they took great risks. They had been entrusted with great amounts of money. You know, a talent was a huge sum, about 15 years' wages for a servant. And one of them had 5 talents, and the other had 2 talents. You know, they could have lost part of that. They could have lost all of it, but they took a risk. The third servant in this story was afraid to risk anything, and so he buried it in the ground. Jesus wants us to take risks for the sake of divine values and gospel priorities. And when you lay that parable beside the one we read from Matthew 25 today, the question becomes, will we take risks for the sake of the least? That is the divine value and gospel priority in the reign of Christ. Does that divine value and gospel priority reign in our lives and rule in our hearts and in our bank accounts? Will we risk pledging for giving in 2024 and giving generously to the reign of Christ, who makes the least a divine value and a gospel priority? Well, then the question becomes, who do we see when we look at the Rogers of the world? Who do we see when we look at the people at the freeway exits with the signs saying, you know, they need help of some sort? You know, if we even look, because I confess I look away. Or, you know, okay, this is a confession time. I pull my car up so that I don't know what you call that bar that separates the windshield from the side, so that it blocks out the guy who's standing over there sometimes, because I don't want to look. Who do we see? You know, when we debate whether shelter or bathroom facilities or basic health care or enough food to eat is an entitlement or a basic human right, and how much is it going to cost us? Who do you see if you're a Democrat looking at a Republican? Or a Republican looking at a Democrat? Or an independent looking at both? Some people still look at Jimmy Carter and see loser, even this week, as he buries his beloved wife of 77 years. Jimmy Carter said, "The best thing I ever did was marry Rosalind. That's my greatest achievement, most significant success, and the pinnacle of my life." Jimmy Carter was also a Sunday school teacher before he was president and after he was president. And in a teaching on this very parable from Matthew 25, he said, you only have 2 loves in your life: for God and for the person in front of you at any particular moment. I would not call anybody who can think that way and try to live their life that way a loser. But then it seems his words reflect divine values and gospel priorities that the world does not value and does not make a priority. Who do you see if you look at someone sitting in the back of a police car? Who do you see if you look at a police officer? I mean, do you actually look at the person in the uniform, or do you just see the uniform? Who do we see when we look at a person wearing a turban or an hijab or a yarmulke or a Star of David or someone in a wheelchair or missing a body part or their face is badly burned or disfigured in some way? You know, the list of those whom the world considers the least, you know, it just goes on and on and on. Who do you see when you look in the mirror? This is the reign of Christ, that wherever Jesus Christ reigns, no one is unclean, no one is unworthy, no one is unacceptable. We may be unrighteous, okay? In fact, we are. And the divine value and gospel priority is that Jesus loves us still. So much so that Jesus became the least. Jesus was last and lost in a manger, for which we will begin preparing next week, on a cross and in a tomb, and Christ rose again to reign, to live and to love all those the world counts as the least forever and ever. Amen.